The HOA board thought they had it all figured out. They were convinced that they were about to crush a defenseless, grieving teenager in court. They smirked, confident that their legal team, their resources, and their ruthless tactics would silence him. After all, he was just a 19-year-old kid, disabled and alone, struggling to hold on to the home his parents had left him after their tragic deaths. The HOA had been waiting for this moment, biding their time, waiting for his parents to be out of the picture so they could prey on the one person they thought couldn't fight back. They saw an easy target, a boy who had lost everything, a boy who was still reeling from the sudden, senseless loss of his parents. They had no compassion, no mercy. To them, he was just another obstacle in their path, someone they could bully into submission. They were determined to take his property, confident that he lacked the means to fight back. But what they didn't know was that the boy they mocked, the boy they underestimated, was about to dismantle their entire case piece by piece. This is the story of Ethan Carter, a young man who refused to back down, and the HOA board that learned the hard way that underestimating someone can be the biggest mistake of your life. The tension inside the courtroom was almost unbearable, thick like a storm cloud ready to burst. Every seat in the gallery was filled, occupied by curious onlookers whispering among themselves. Some leaned forward, eager to witness the spectacle unfold. Others sat back, shaking their heads, convinced they already knew how this was going to end. The rows of HOA board members sat smugly in the gallery, their well-dressed attorneys exchanging knowing glances, already celebrating a victory they hadn't yet won. At the center of it all stood Ethan Carter, a young disabled man, alone and without resources, standing against a powerful homeowners association that had been ruthless in its pursuit of his family's home. They had no idea what was coming. The heavy wooden defendant's table seemed almost comically large compared to Ethan's lean frame. He stood beside it, his crutches resting against the edge, untouched. Though he could have used them for support, he chose not to, a silent statement that he would not be seen as weak today. His posture was slightly hunched, the weight of grief still clinging to him. Just months ago, his world had shattered. His parents, his anchors, his protectors were gone, ripped away by a senseless accident that never should have happened. One rainy evening, they had been driving home from a family dinner. It had been a rare night where laughter had filled the car, where his mom had playfully scolded his dad for missing a turn, where Ethan had felt safe, whole. But then, blinding headlights, the deafening screech of brakes, the violent crunch of metal. A reckless driver speeding through an intersection took them both. Ethan had survived, but just barely. The crash had left him with injuries that would forever remind him of that night. His body had healed, but the scars, both physical and emotional, would never fade. Now, the home his parents had fought so hard for, the place filled with their memories, was all he had left of them. And the HOA wanted to take that too. The HOA's tactics were as cold as they were calculated. They had moved the fence line, encroaching on Ethan's property inch by inch, as if he wouldn't notice. They slapped him with fraudulent violations, a chipped paint fine here, an unauthorized wheelchair ramp there. The infractions were fabricated, the fees outrageous. They assumed he wouldn't have the money to fight back. Court cases were expensive, and their lawyers were among the best money could buy. They banked on intimidation and financial exhaustion. But it wasn't just about harassment. No, they had a bigger plan. The HOA knew exactly what they were doing. They were burying Ethan in debt, slapping him with unpayable fines, racking up legal fees he couldn't afford. They weren't just trying to intimidate him, they were setting him up for financial ruin. Because once he couldn't pay, they would strike. A missed payment here, a late fee there, and then they'd rip the house from under him, selling it off to one of their own at a fraction of its worth. A grieving orphan thrown onto the street while they profited from his loss. It was cruel. It was calculated. And they thought it was inevitable. One of the HOA representatives had even chuckled at Ethan before the hearing. "Listen, Ethan," the man had said, his voice dripping with condescension. "This is just business. You don't have the money, and we do. You're going to lose, so why drag it out?" Ethan hadn't responded. He just memorized the smug expression on the man's face. He'd wipe it off soon enough. The lead attorney for the HOA, Garrett Caldwell, sat back in his seat, exuding an air of overconfidence. As he adjusted his expensive tailored suit, his smug smirk hadn't faded since the moment he walked into the courtroom. To him, this wasn't a case. It was a formality, a performance where he already knew the ending. He wasn't alone in his arrogance. The other HOA lawyers chuckled quietly among themselves. Exchanging glances like this was all a joke. The board members sat with folded arms, their expressions dripping with amusement. They were already celebrating. This wasn't a trial to them. It was a spectacle, one where they expected Ethan to fumble, panic, and ultimately lose everything. Garrett finally leaned forward, his fingers lazily tapping against the polished oak table. His sharp gaze swept over Ethan, his lips curling into something between a smirk and a sneer. "So, let me get this straight," Garrett drawled, his voice carrying the same dry amusement one might use when scolding a child for speaking out of turn. "You actually think you can argue this case on your own?" A few chuckles rippled through the HOA side of the courtroom. Their lawyers smirked. The board members shook their heads. Even the HOA secretary seated in the gallery covered her mouth to stifle a laugh. Ethan didn't say a word. He didn't react to the snide remarks, the quiet laughter, the sheer disrespect dripping from every corner of the room. They thought this was funny. They had no idea who they were dealing with. He just sat there, still, silent, watching, waiting. Then Garrett sighed dramatically, flipping through his neatly organized case file with the casual arrogance of a man who had already won. "Your Honor," he began, dragging out the words as if even speaking them was a waste of time. "Let's not waste the court's valuable time here. We all know how this ends. Mr. Carter is in blatant violation of HOA rules, and there is no legal precedent that can save him." He paused for effect, casting a quick glance toward Ethan as if waiting for him to shrink under the weight of his words. When Ethan didn't react, Garrett's smirk deepened. "Your Honor," he continued, his voice taking on a feigned air of professionalism, "this case is simple. The defendant, Mr. Carter, has repeatedly violated HOA regulations. And these aren't minor infractions. These are direct, documented violations that threaten the integrity of our community's property values." He flicked his wrist, picking up a thick stack of papers before dropping them dramatically onto the table. "First and foremost," Garrett continued, his tone condescending, "he has repeatedly ignored notices to correct unapproved modifications to his property. Despite clear HOA guidelines, Mr. Carter constructed an unauthorized wheelchair ramp, which, while unfortunate, violates aesthetic standards outlined in our neighborhood's covenant." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Ethan's jaw clenched, but he didn't react. Garrett wasn't done. "There's also the matter of the fence," he went on, flipping a page. "Mr. Carter has refused to comply with property line adjustments outlined by the HOA's community mapping." Ethan knew exactly what that meant. They had moved the property line, stealing inches of his land and claiming it as theirs. And now they were accusing him of violating it. "The defendant has been issued multiple warnings," Garrett added smoothly. "His fines have gone unpaid. The HOA, in good faith, has tried to work with him, but he refuses to comply." Then came the final blow. "Which brings us to the matter of trespassing," Garrett said, his voice rising slightly for emphasis. "The defendant was caught accessing property that was no longer his, according to HOA boundary adjustments. The HOA's investigator personally witnessed him violating the property line before issuing fines and penalties. This alone is enough to warrant a violation." Garrett turned toward the jury, shaking his head with mock disappointment. "Your Honor, this case isn't just about rules. This is about a homeowner who refuses to respect the very guidelines that keep our neighborhood safe, clean, and desirable. The HOA has given him every opportunity to resolve these issues peacefully, and instead, through his noncompliance with our demands, he has chosen to turn this into a legal circus. Frankly, Your Honor," Garrett continued, "this isn't even worth a lengthy trial. The evidence speaks for itself. This young man is desperately trying to hold on to something that no longer belongs to him." Another murmur of agreement from the HOA's table. One of the board members audibly scoffed. Ethan simply watched. Garrett leaned back, completely at ease. He had already won. Ethan was just a formality, a loose end to be tied up. But the problem with men like Garrett is that they never see the storm coming until it's already overhead. Ethan had spent months preparing for this. Not for this exact moment. He never planned to stand here alone, fighting for his home, defending himself against people who once pretended to care. But he had studied everything. While other kids memorized football stats, Ethan memorized property law. While his peers played video games, sinking hours into fantasy battles and high scores, Ethan played out mock trials in his mind, crafting arguments, dismantling imaginary cases, preparing for battles that no one ever thought he would have to fight. While other kids spent summers at the beach, Ethan spent his in libraries. He would sit beside his father, listening as he dissected rulings, debated legal theories, and exposed the cracks in ironclad cases. Most kids wanted to be astronauts or athletes. Ethan, he wanted to understand the rules that controlled the world. While his former neighbors ignored him, he dissected every case the HOA had ever won. They thought he was just a kid grasping at straws. They were about to realize just how wrong they were. Ethan's father, Franklin Carter, had worked as a paralegal for over 2 decades. He wasn't a lawyer, but he might as well have been. He had seen how the system worked and how it failed. He had spent years inside courtrooms, watching attorneys fumble cases, cut corners, and sell out their clients for quick settlements. He had seen how prosecutors twisted evidence, how judges had their favorites, how defense attorneys sometimes barely put up a fight. Ethan absorbed everything. As a child, he would sit at the dinner table, listening to his father vent to his mom after a long day. "The firm took another plea deal today," Franklin would say, shaking his head. "The defendant didn't even know he had better options. That prosecutor, he knows how to manipulate a jury. Uses emotion over facts every time. Some attorneys don't even read half the cases they take on. They just assume they'll settle before trial." Most kids tuned out when their parents talked about work. Ethan studied every word. As a result, by the time Ethan was 10 years old, he could break down a court case better than most first-year law students. His brain worked differently. When he watched courtroom dramas, he didn't just enjoy the story, he paused the screen, rewound testimony, and picked apart every flaw in the argument with his father. When he saw an injustice, he didn't just get angry, he dissected it. He researched, looking up statutes and precedents, figuring out how it could have been fought and won. Every question, every strategy, every argument. His father was there, pushing him to think deeper. "Don't just tell me it's unfair," his father would say. "Tell me how you'd fight it. And tell me how you'd win." His father used to tell him, "You'd make a great attorney one day." While his classmates worried about high school exams, Ethan was reading real court transcripts. He was never supposed to use this knowledge for himself. He had never imagined that his first case would be his own, and that his opponent would be a corrupt HOA and a smug, overconfident attorney who thought they had already won. Sitting in the courtroom, Judge Malcolm Reeves remained neutral, his expression unreadable. He wasn't laughing, unlike the HOA's legal team. He wasn't here to make a spectacle out of Ethan's suffering. He tapped a finger against his bench, waiting for the HOA's attorney to wrap up his monologue. "Are you finished, Mr. Caldwell?" the judge asked, his tone even. Garrett gave an exaggerated nod, closing his case file with a satisfied snap. "Yes, Your Honor. I believe the facts speak for themselves. Frankly, I'd rather not spend my entire afternoon on this. I have a golf game at 2. A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom, mostly from the HOA's side. Garrett smirked at the reaction, leaning back in his chair, completely at ease. To him, this wasn't a real case. It was a formality, a waste of time. Judge Malcolm Reeves lifted an eyebrow at the remark, his expression unreadable. He didn't comment. He simply flipped open the case file in front of him, leaned back in his chair, and exhaled slowly. His expression remained neutral, but there was a flicker of something, mild surprise, perhaps, before he spoke. "Mr. Carter," he said, "your lawyer." Ethan lifted his chin slightly. "I'll be representing myself, Your Honor." A ripple of amusement spread through the courtroom. The lead HOA attorney, Garrett Caldwell, smirked. "Representing yourself?" Garrett let out a low, amused chuckle, shaking his head. "Oh, this is going to be fun." Another HOA lawyer shook his head in mock disbelief, letting out a dramatic sigh. "Kid, this isn't some school debate tournament. This is real court, real law. You sure you don't want to save yourself the embarrassment?" Ethan didn't blink, didn't shift, didn't react. He was used to being underestimated. He had spent his childhood navigating a world that saw his disability before his intellect. He had learned patience, had mastered the art of watching and waiting. His late father, a paralegal, had often told him, "The law isn't about who has the most money. It's about who knows how to use it." And Ethan knew. The judge gave a small nod. "Very well. Proceed." His voice was steady, but for the first time, there was a pause, like a brief hesitation, as if even he sensed that something was about to change. No one in the courtroom was laughing when Ethan took his first step forward. The smug smiles, the quiet chuckles, the dismissive glances, they all disappeared. Because for the first time, they all really saw him. Ethan gripped his crutches and moved with slow, deliberate precision, each step calculated, not because he wanted to draw attention to himself, but because he had no choice. The soft metallic click of the crutch tips against the polished courtroom floor echoed in the silence, a sound that had followed him all his life. A sound that reminded him of every hallway in school where other kids rushed past while he struggled to keep up. A sound that reminded him of every time he was left behind on field trips because no one wanted to wait for him. A sound that reminded him of standing in the rain outside his house after his parents' funeral, gripping those same crutches, listening to well-meaning neighbors murmur, "Poor boy. What's he going to do now?" And now, here he was, standing in a courtroom, facing people who wanted to take away the last thing his parents left him. My wife and I sat in the gallery, our hands clenched together, holding on to each other for strength. We had raised our own children, had seen hardships, lived through struggles, but nothing prepared us for the weight of watching our grandson fight a battle he should never have had to face. We weren't alone either. Aunts, uncles, family, friends, we were all there. We had come not just to watch, but to bear witness, to show the HOA, their smug lawyers, and anyone else who dared to doubt him that Ethan Carter was not alone. But as much as we wanted to fight for him, we knew this was his moment. Ethan adjusted his stance, his hands tightening around the grips of his crutches. His posture remained straight, his expression unreadable, but the weight of everything was there, the exhaustion, the grief, the quiet defiance. He let the silence stretch just a little too long, long enough that the amusement in the room turned into discomfort, long enough that someone in the gallery shifted in their seat, clearing their throat, suddenly aware of how quiet it had become. And then, finally, he spoke. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady and clear. "Before I begin, I'd like to clarify something with the prosecution." Garrett Caldwell, still lounging in his chair, let out an exaggerated sigh. "By all means," he said, folding his arms, his tone dripping with mock patience. Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable. He met Garrett's gaze without hesitation. "Mr. Caldwell," Ethan said, "just to confirm, your case relies on the claim that the HOA's investigator personally witnessed me violating the property line before issuing fines and penalties. Is that correct?" Garrett scoffed, barely concealing his boredom. "That's right," he said dismissively. Ethan tilted his head slightly, as if weighing his next words carefully. "And that claim is documented in the official HOA report. Correct?" Garrett rolled his eyes, already losing patience. "Obviously. It's all in the written report. Clear as day." Ethan didn't react. Instead, he shifted his focus to Judge Malcolm Reeves. His voice didn't waver. "Your Honor," he said, "I move to dismiss that testimony as evidence." And just like that, the air in the courtroom changed. Judge Malcolm Reeves squinted at Ethan, his brow furrowing slightly. On what grounds? The room was still, the weight of the moment pressing against the silence. For the first time since stepping forward, Ethan pulled his hands from his pockets. He adjusted his grip on his crutches before gesturing toward Garrett Caldwell's table, his movements deliberate. Then, with a voice steady and unwavering, he dropped the first bombshell. "Because the HOA's investigator never actually saw me violating the property line. In fact, he wasn't even present when the alleged infraction occurred." A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Garrett's smirk faltered for just a fraction of a second, just enough for Ethan to catch it. But Ethan wasn't done. Ethan had spent weeks preparing for this, late nights combing through surveillance footage, property reports, and timestamps, hours reading and rereading the HOA's own documents, searching for weaknesses in their case. And now, he had found the first crack. The prosecution's entire argument hinged on the investigator's direct observation. Without it, their case was no longer solid. It was crumbling. Ethan straightened his posture, his eyes locked on Garrett. Let's see how he tries to talk his way out of this, he thought. For the first time since the trial began, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Garrett Caldwell's face. It was small, barely there, but Ethan caught it. Garrett had walked into this courtroom certain of an easy win, too sure of himself, too confident in his airtight case. But now, something wasn't adding up, and it showed. Ethan took another slow step forward, his movements deliberate, his crutches pressing against the polished floor with a steady rhythm. He wasn't just fighting for his home. He was dismantling their lies, brick by brick. "Your Honor," he said, his voice clear and firm, "if the court allows, I'd like to submit more evidence contradicting the HOA's claims." Judge Reeves raised an eyebrow. "Explain." Ethan walked to the evidence table with a calm, measured step. "First, let's discuss the alleged fence line violation. The HOA moved my property boundary, claiming encroachment. However, he placed a document on the table. This is an independent land survey I commissioned, proving the original boundary. The HOA's change was fraudulent." Caldwell's smirk faltered slightly. "That's irrelevant," he began, but Ethan cut him off. "Second," Ethan continued, "I'd like to enter into evidence a copy of my parents' original HOA contract." He placed another document down. "Nowhere in this contract does it state that property lines can be adjusted without homeowner consent." He turned to the judge. "Which means the HOA's actions were illegal." Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Ethan wasn't done. "Furthermore," he continued, his voice unwavering, "the HOA fined me for violations that were never cited before my parents' passing." In fact, he tapped a new document. This is an internal HOA email, obtained legally, stating, and I quote, "The Carter boy can't fight this. He doesn't have the money. Keep the pressure on until he sells." The courtroom fell silent. Garrett's face drained of color. "Objection!" Garrett shouted, but Ethan turned, his eyes sharp. "Was what?" Ethan shot back. "Evidence of harassment? Fraud? Malicious intent?" At the HOA's table, the board members weren't smirking anymore. The once confident president of the HOA, Mr. Holloway, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. Beside him, Mrs. Langford, the treasurer, hastily flipped through documents, as if searching for something, anything, to save them. But there was nothing left. Everything was crumbling in real time. One of the board members, a nervous-looking man in a too-tight suit, leaned toward Garrett, whispering harshly. "Fix this," he hissed, his voice barely audible. This wasn't supposed to happen. But Garrett didn't move, didn't speak, because he knew, as well as they did, there was no fixing this. Ethan had ripped their case apart, exposed their lies, their greed, their corruption. And now, everyone in that courtroom was watching them drown. Judge Malcolm Reeves took the document, his expression unreadable as his eyes moved over the contents. Then he read it again, slower this time. The change was subtle at first, the way his fingers tightened around the edges of the paper, the way his jaw set just a little firmer. Then his gaze lifted, sharp and piercing, and landed directly on Garrett Caldwell. "Mr. Caldwell," the judge's voice was no longer neutral. It carried a weight, a warning. "Are you prepared to dispute the authenticity of this email?" A silence stretched across the room, heavy and expectant. Garrett didn't answer immediately, and that was his biggest mistake. The judge exhaled sharply, setting the document down with a deliberate motion. He wasn't just holding a piece of paper. He was holding evidence of something much bigger. He tapped his fingers against the bench, his next words coming slower, more pointed. "Because if this email is real," he said, his gaze darkening, "then this entire case is built on deception. Which means," he paused, letting the words sink in, "someone has a lot to answer for." The murmur in the gallery swelled. One of the jurors shifted in their seat, whispering to the person beside them. Ethan remained silent, because this was no longer just a case about HOA violations. This was about fraud, corruption, an entire scheme designed to steal from a grieving young man. And now, the judge saw it too. Ethan exhaled slowly, letting the weight of the moment settle. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady, "I move for immediate dismissal of all HOA claims. Their case is built on fraudulent evidence and unethical tactics." Judge Reeves studied the evidence for a long moment, then slowly exhaled, shaking his head just slightly, like a man realizing he had almost let something terrible slip through the cracks. "Motion granted," he declared. "Case dismissed." Garrett Caldwell's face was pale now, his usual cocky demeanor completely stripped away. But men like him didn't go down without a fight. He shot up from his chair, grasping at one last thread of control. "Objection, Your Honor." His voice cracked slightly, but he recovered quickly, straightening his tie as if he still had a grip on the situation. This is irrelevant speculation. The defendant is twisting facts to mislead the court. Judge Malcolm Reeves slowly turned to look at him, unamused. A long pause, then a single sharp tap of the judge's gavel. Overruled. That one word sealed it. Garrett's shoulders tensed, his mouth opening as if he wanted to argue, but nothing came out. Because there was nothing left to say, Judge Reeves folded his hands and leveled Garrett with a piercing stare. Mr. Caldwell, this court does not tolerate deception. Not from attorneys, and certainly not from those who claim to uphold community standards. He let the words settle before delivering the final blow. I suggest you and your clients prepare yourselves. If this email is real, there will be consequences beyond this courtroom. A stunned silence filled the room, then chaos. Whispers, reporters scribbling notes, the HOA board members fuming as they realized they had just been outmaneuvered by a teenager they had mocked. Ethan sat still for a moment, absorbing the victory, his heart hammering in his chest. Then he looked up to meet the eyes of Garrett Caldwell. The man looked pale, rattled, his earlier arrogance completely gone. Ethan gave him the smallest nod, calm, collected, victorious. For months, I had watched my grandson carry a burden no 19-year-old should ever have to bear. I had watched him stand alone, fight alone, and be underestimated at every turn. I had watched those smug HOA board members mock him, dismiss him, try to break him. But Ethan, he never wavered. And now, as the judge delivered his final ruling, as Garrett Caldwell's face fell, and as the courtroom sat in stunned silence, I realized something. My grandson had won the moment the gavel struck. My wife, Margaret, let out a shaky breath beside me. She had been holding it for far too long. Her hands trembled in her lap, her knuckles white from how tightly she had clutched them together. She turned to me, her eyes brimming with tears, but these weren't tears of sorrow. They were tears of relief, of pride, of justice. I felt a lump rise in my throat as I looked at my grandson, my boy standing there, shoulders squared, head held high, victorious. I had known Ethan was smart. I had known he was strong. But today he was unstoppable. The courtroom buzzed with hushed murmurs, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. The HOA board members were in disarray. Whispers, frantic gestures, the unmistakable look of people who knew they had just lost everything. But Ethan, he didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He just stood there, calm, steady, like he had known this outcome all along. And then, for the first time, he turned to look at us. Margaret didn't hesitate. She was already out of her seat, rushing toward him before he could take another step. She threw her arms around him, clutching him like she had when he was a boy, before life had taken so much from him. "You did it, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You did it." I rose to my feet, my old bones aching from the weight of years, but I didn't care. I placed a firm hand on his shoulder, squeezing it tightly. I had never been a man of many words, but in that moment, I only needed one. "Your father would be proud, Ethan." He stilled. For the first time, I saw the emotion break through his carefully built composure. His eyes glistened just slightly, his throat bobbing as he swallowed down whatever words had tried to form. And then he nodded. No words were needed, because in that moment, he knew. He had fought. He had won. And he had made his father proud. And as I looked at my grandson, not just as the boy I had helped raise, but as a man who had fought for what was right, I realized something else. I had never been prouder. Outside the courthouse, the air buzzed with chaos. Reporters swarmed the steps, their voices a tangled mess of overlapping questions. Cameras flashed in rapid bursts. Microphones jutted toward Ethan like weapons, each reporter desperate for a soundbite. "Ethan, did you know the judge was going to dismiss the case? What's your next move now that you've won? How does it feel to outmaneuver an experienced legal team?" The questions came fast, loud, relentless. Ethan didn't flinch. He exhaled slowly, then reached up and pulled the hood of his sweatshirt over his head, not in defeat, not in retreat, but because he had no interest in this circus. This wasn't about the cameras. This wasn't about proving how smart he was. This had never been about winning for the sake of winning. It had always been about something bigger. Ethan had fought for his home, his future, the legacy his parents had left behind. And now, as he stepped past the flashing lights, ignoring the shouted questions, he realized something. This battle was over, but the war, the war was just beginning. The cameras kept flashing, the voices of reporters still shouting for a response, but Ethan wasn't paying attention anymore. This chapter was over. Across the street, standing beside his car, Judge Malcolm Reeves watched. His posture was different now, no longer the detached authority of a man passing judgment. Instead, something else flickered in his expression: recognition. Not just of Ethan's resilience, but of his undeniable talent. Ethan met his gaze for a brief moment. Then, without a word, he turned toward me and his grandmother. She reached out gently, supporting him as he made his way toward our car. That's when I noticed it. Judge Reeves had left his car too. At first, it seemed like he was headed toward the courthouse doors, but then he veered slightly, walking directly toward us. And just as we reached the car, his voice cut through the air. "Mr. Carter." Ethan stopped. A pause. Then Judge Reeves spoke again, his tone different this time. Not dismissive, not authoritative, but sincere. "You should consider law school." For a brief second, Ethan smiled. A small, knowing smile. He didn't need to consider it. He was already on his way. Ethan paused, then finally spoke. "I don't just want to study law, Your Honor. I want to change it." Ethan had won, but as he sat in the car, the courthouse fading behind him, his victory didn't feel like an ending. It felt like the beginning of something much bigger. He had the knowledge to fight back, but what about the ones who didn't? How many others had been bullied by powerful organizations, buried under paperwork, suffocated by legal fees, and forced to give up what was rightfully theirs simply because they didn't know how to fight? This case had never been about ego. It had never been about proving he was smarter than them. It had been about justice. And if there was one thing Ethan knew now, it was that this courtroom wouldn't be the last one he stood in. But next time, he wouldn't be the defendant. He'd be the attorney. And when that day came, he wouldn't be the only one. Because the system wasn't broken. It was rigged. And Ethan Carter was about to do something about it. If this story made you think, even for a second, then share it. Because standing up for what's right starts with awareness. If you believe in justice and standing up for what's right, and want to continue to see more stories like this, make sure you like and subscribe to our channel. Every day, we share captivating stories of resilience, courage, and the fight for justice, stories you won't want to miss. After the resounding victory against the HOA, Ethan Carter was no longer the underestimated 19-year-old boy. He became a symbol of resilience and justice in the community. But for Ethan, that victory was just the beginning. He knew that the legal system still harbored many injustices, and he was determined to change that. Stepping into law school, Ethan enrolled in a prestigious law school where he could learn and hone his legal knowledge. However, his journey was far from easy. He faced skepticism from those around him, people who still saw him through the lens of a disabled boy who couldn't possibly become a lawyer. But Ethan didn't give up. He spent countless hours in the library, studying cases, and participating in legal debates. He wasn't just learning to become a skilled lawyer, he was also gaining a deeper understanding of the flaws in the legal system and how to fix them. After graduating, Ethan established a small law firm dedicated to defending the rights of the vulnerable. His first case was strikingly similar to his own. An elderly woman was being threatened by her HOA with the loss of the home she had lived in for 30 years over minor and unjustified violations. Ethan used all his knowledge and experience to defend her. He not only proved that the HOA's allegations were baseless, but also exposed their corruption and abuse of power. The case ended in another resounding victory, and Ethan once again proved that justice could prevail if someone had the courage to fight for it. However, Ethan's journey wasn't without its challenges. He faced numerous obstacles, both inside and outside the courtroom. Powerful organizations, those he had defeated before, constantly sought to undermine him. They spread rumors, filed lawsuits, and even threatened his life. But Ethan wasn't alone. He received support from the community, from people who had been treated unjustly and believed in his mission. His family and friends stood by his side, giving him strength during the toughest times. After years of fighting, Ethan Carter wasn't just a successful lawyer. He was also a legal reformer. He founded a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping the vulnerable fight against injustice. His organization changed the lives of thousands, bringing justice and hope to those who had been oppressed by the system. Ethan was honored with numerous prestigious awards, but for him, The greatest reward was seeing those who had been wronged live in peace and happiness. He became an inspiration to many, especially people with disabilities, proving that nothing is impossible if you have enough determination and courage. In a speech at his law school graduation, Ethan shared, "Justice isn't something that's given freely. It has to be fought for, earned bit by bit. And I believe that each of us has the power to create change. Stand up, fight, and never let anyone tell you that you're not capable." Ethan Carter's story isn't just a journey of fighting for justice. It's a testament to the power of will and perseverance. He proved that no matter how difficult the starting point, with belief and determination, we can overcome any challenge and create meaningful change. I hope this story continues to inspire you and those around you, reminding us that justice always exists, and each of us can be a part of that change. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.